My entitled family wants to take my house and give it to my brother. Even though they kicked me out of their home because they had no space for me, now they want to take my house and give it to my brother. I'll warn everyone here that this is going to be very long. So long, in fact, that I'm splitting it into 2 posts and including a TLDR for each. I also really don't care who believes this. It's so crazy that I don't blame anyone who calls BS. I won't argue about it, but this did happen to me. I also don't care if anyone in my family sees this. I'm not going to sugarcoat anything, but I'm also not going to reveal any details that would clue anyone into who I am that doesn't already know me. I'm a single man in my early 30s. I have a brother who's 29 and already has 4 kids. He had his first at 22, the second followed a year later, the third 2 years after that, and the fourth, the most recently born, came just a couple of months ago. His wife, let's call her Syl, and I do not get along. She likes to try and get a rise out of me by acting superior, then turns into an extreme self-victimizing drama queen if I retaliate. If I react in any way, she can cry on cue and put on an extremely convincing show to get sympathy from nearly anyone. My parents and brother absolutely adore her. Even though they know exactly how she really is, they just don't care. She's very good looking, I'll give her that, but she's so awful that I could never be attracted to her. She also refuses to get any sort of job, even though she has a college degree. My mother willingly helps with the kids all day, so their finances are entirely dependent on my brother. This also means they can't afford to live anywhere but my parents' house. Privacy is a bit of an issue with all of them under one roof in a 3-bedroom house that was built in the 60s. Growing up, my younger brother was the obvious favorite. We're 3 years apart, but he developed a superiority complex because I was severely punished if I retaliated against his antics. Back then, it was clear that my parents cared for him much more than me. He got the lion's share of everything, unless people called him out on it, something that happened quite a bit with other family members. That's why my parents decided to move us about 150 miles away from them so they would only see us on holidays, since it was a 3-hour drive. My brother was physically abusive toward me on a number of occasions, flirted relentlessly with my first girlfriend, to the point she broke up with me, and laughed at any misfortune I had. My parents just told me to suck it up whenever I was upset about it. I only got equal treatment when my parents wanted to keep up appearances. It was rather funny to see the looks on their faces whenever they had to treat me equally to my brother on birthdays and Christmas, especially when other people were around. We had relatives who were very nosy and loved gossiping, so my parents did their best to hide what was really going on, threatening to take away all my stuff if I didn't keep my mouth shut. If anything, it just made my parents celebrate more when I turned 18 and moved out because it meant they no longer had to provide for me. I wasn't even done with high school yet, but couch surfing was far better than living with them. I've kept low contact ever since leaving home. They didn't even show up for my high school graduation, but honestly, I didn't care. From that point on, I usually only saw my parents and brother on holidays, like the rest of the family. The start of the 2020 pandemic wasn't kind to me. I lost my job and couldn't renew the lease on my condo because my roommate also lost his job. Neither of us could afford the place on unemployment money. It was a 2-bedroom condo that I really loved, but as the lease was ending, my roommate moved back in with relatives, and I had to sell nearly all of my stuff to avoid becoming homeless. I really shouldn't have rented a place that expensive, but I liked living the high life until it came crashing down. I realized I should have been living somewhere cheaper to save more money for situations like this. But I had a plan. I owned a truck simply because I've always loved trucks, so I found a $1,000 camper in good shape, put it on my truck, and lived out of it for a while. It was supposed to be temporary, but I ended up living in it much longer than I expected. I originally hoped to park it at my parents' house, where my brother and his family still lived. But when I asked my parents to let me stay for a while, they told me they had a full house and didn't want me there. Plus, we hadn't exactly gotten along in the past decade. They said they'd only let me park my camper there if I paid them basically what it would cost to rent an apartment in my area. That was way too much just to park a camper. I was jobless and trying to save as much of my unemployment as I could until I found a new job. I ended up parking my camper in a store parking lot on the first night that I had nowhere else to go. I felt terrified that someone might try to break in. Suffice to say, I didn't sleep well that night. There were no other relatives nearby, and all my friends lived in apartments, so I stayed attached to the area. I forwarded my mail to a friend's apartment, which was the only way I could still get my mail. Finding a stable place to park was difficult, but I kept looking around while trying to find a job. It took months of living the nomadic camper life. During this time, I had to deal with a lot. Beggars, drug addicts, people demanding I leave because my camper was an eyesore. At one point, someone who told me to move claimed to be part of the HOA. I wasn't even parked on a street with houses, and when I questioned which HOA they were talking about, they got belligerent and threatened me. I moved my camper anyway to avoid trouble. To have a steady power supply, I learned to use a long extension cord to plug into any outlet I could find. This meant sneaking around and plugging into the outside outlets of random buildings while parked on the street. I know it's a crummy thing to do, but I had to keep my camper batteries charged for my refrigerator to stay cold. I also had a small solar power bag for my phone, but I didn't have a generator, and generators are noisy and require fuel. So I did what I had to do. After months of living like that, I finally managed to get a new job. I had to move to a neighboring city to find something that didn't involve retail. I had promised myself never to work retail again after college. I was still getting unemployment money, but I didn't have a stable place to live while receiving it, and I didn't want to be jobless when that ran out. Plus, I was bored out of my mind, with little else to do but read, watch movies on a small portable DVD player, use my phone or my laptop, and keep track of where I could park and what local public bathrooms I could use. So after that whole drama with my parents and brother, I thought it was over. But, of course, they weren't done. A few days later, I come home to find a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked right in my driveway. Yep, you guessed it. Dan and his whole family were trying to move in. I saw him standing there with that smug grin, like he had won some victory. He waved like we were best buddies. I lost it. I told him to stop, but Dan just smirked and said, like it or not, we're moving in. And get this, Sela, in the most fake, sweet tone ever, says, it's okay, Mommy allowed it. You should listen to Mommy. I was fuming. Just hearing her say, that sent me into a rage. I locked myself in my truck and called the cops immediately. And what does Sela do? She starts pounding on my window, yelling at me to stop and crying about how they need the house. She says, why can't you just do this for Dan? I told her to stop. I'm not doing this for anyone, especially not for Dan. It's my house. If she thought she could threaten me, she was wrong. She even threatened to damage my truck unless I stopped calling the police. But what she didn't know was I had the window cracked just enough for the 911 operator to hear everything. So when the police arrived, things got even more serious. Dan and Sela had actually changed the locks to my front door and left the tools and broken lock just sitting there on the porch. They couldn't have been more obvious if they tried. I pointed it out to the cops and they immediately started asking questions. My parents, of course, showed up during all of this. They immediately started lying, saying I had agreed to rent the house to Dan. I said, that's an easily provable lie. And if you keep pushing this, we'll call it for what it is, fraud. And that's when things got crazy. Dan and Sela came out of the house looking like they had won. They were holding what they claimed was a rental agreement, but the signature was clearly forged. It didn't look anything like mine. I told them that if they wanted to keep up with this, the cops could easily figure out the forgery. I also mentioned that breaking into my house and forging documents could land them in legal trouble. Dan went white. He looked scared. But my mom, of course, stepped in to defend them. She kept insisting I should just let them stay. She said I should make a sacrifice for Dan and his family. I snapped. I told her if it's such a good idea, why don't you do it for Dan? Let him have your house. She kept trying to push, but I made it clear they needed to leave or I'd press charges. Then, Sela, not realizing when to quit, started throwing a tantrum. She ripped up the fake rental papers and tossed them in the air like confetti. One of the officers had to tell her to pick up the pieces, or she'd get a citation for littering. Dan's kids were all crying, and Dan tried to guilt-trip me, asking if I was satisfied with what I'd done. I didn't hesitate. I laughed and said, you're not sharing, Dan. You're just trying to take everything from me. You're no brother of mine. I stood my ground. Even when he started yelling, the cops told him to calm down, and at that point, they weren't going anywhere. They called in backup, and 2 cops became 4. That was enough to get my parents to realize they couldn't intimidate me. Before they left, I made Dan give me the keys to the new lock he'd put on my front door. He tried to throw them away, but one of the officers made him go retrieve them. He had to pull the storm drain cover off to get them back. Finally, I told them to never come back. My mom tried to say I'd be disowned for what I'd done, but I just laughed and said, go ahead, I won't miss the holidays where I'm treated like garbage. I told them, you've always made it clear Dan is your favorite. I added, and if Dan ever needed something from me, I wouldn't give it to him. The cops were just silent. They stood there, probably judging my parents for once. As they packed up and left, my mother kept trying to negotiate with me. First, it was, Dan will pay rent. Then it was, you can live with us and Dan can rent your house. I just told her to stop talking and keep packing. I didn't want Dan and his family near me, and I didn't want to ever live with them again. Finally, they left. My parents, brother, and Sela, they packed their stuff and drove off. And that was it, or so I thought. It was petty of me, but I couldn't hold back when I pointed out how poorly Sil was handling things as a mother. She lets my mom do most of the parenting while she spends her time lounging around, drinking, playing on her phone, and blowing through Dan's money. And yet, she has the nerve to complain about it. I even joked that I'm surprised her baby doesn't get drunk from her breast milk since she drinks so much, which I admit was a bit too far. I could tell by the glares I got that it landed with a thud. Sil demanded to know if I was calling her a bad mom. I told her that the evidence spoke for itself. I told her if she wanted to have any chance of moving out of my parents' house, she'd better start putting that college degree to good use, get a job, learn to save money. My mom was already doing most of the childcare for my brother's kids, so Sil would have plenty of time once her baby was older. At that point, my brother's 7-year-old son ran up and started yelling at me for yelling at his mom. He went on and on about how I was the bad guy who made his mom cry and didn't let them stay in my house. That's when my brother stepped in and pulled his son away, but the tension was already boiling over, and suddenly, it felt like a family intervention against Sil and Dan. By now, Sil was crying, her new baby was crying, and even Dan looked like he might break down. He sat there, looking like a wreck, unable to even make eye contact with anyone. The whole scene was awkward and painful, and honestly, I think everyone was too focused on holding back their own emotions to actually deal with the reality of the situation. It felt like all the masks were finally coming off, and my parents' reputation in the family took a huge hit. Soon after, my parents, brother, and Sil left in defeat. The rest of the party, thankfully, resumed, though we didn't talk about what had just happened. That night, since most of the adults had been drinking, I invited everyone to crash at my place. I even let a few of them sleep in the camper. It's a great guest house, and they were genuinely curious about how I'd been living in it. They couldn't believe I'd been in there for 2 years. The next morning, I was up early with fresh coffee and some ibuprofen for the hangovers. My relatives actually complimented me on being a much better host than my parents ever were. It was a nice moment, and we all agreed to do it again next Christmas. After Christmas, Sil finally stopped making passive-aggressive posts about me and deleted the old ones. But not long after the new year, she made a new post complaining that she'd tried to convince my parents to get a camper like mine, to set up in the backyard so Dan and his family could have the whole house. Well, my parents shot that idea down hard. They weren't about to let anyone push them out of their own home, especially not their master bedroom. Sil took the post down a few days later, and she hasn't posted much since. Looks like she's realizing that complaining on social media doesn't have the same effect when no one's paying attention anymore. Dan, and I haven't spoken much since then, but I think he's starting to understand that he can't live off my parents or my generosity. If they end up expecting another kid, I wouldn't be surprised, but at least for now, things have calmed down for me. I've even been able to host friends for poker nights, though, to be honest, I'm terrible at poker. I can never remember the rules. But we have a good time, drink beer, eat junk food, and laugh like idiots. I'm also thinking about getting into dating again, sometime soon. I'm not exactly getting any younger, so fingers crossed that goes well. The camper still sits unused in my yard, but I've taken to spending some time in it from time to time. After living in it for 2 years, it's kind of like my second home. Maybe one day, I'll get to actually use it for camping like it was originally meant to be. I've never been camping before, and it could be a totally new experience for me. As for my parents, brother, and Sil, they've mostly been staying clear of me. It's kind of like they're pretending I don't exist again, just like they did before I bought my house. Not that it bothers me, honestly. It's easier this way. But I know deep down they'll eventually come crawling back. I'm just waiting to see what kind of ridiculous thing they'll do next. If anything noteworthy happens, I'll update you all again if this account is still active. Update 3. This update won't surprise some of you who predicted what would happen next. After the whole Christmas debacle, my parents and Dan tried the classic move they've been known for, asking me for money. It started when my parents reached out to me on social media, asking to meet up. I could tell right away it was a trap, but I wasn't afraid. I was actually kind of amused. I chose a local restaurant for the meetup, just to see what they were really after. When we sat down, they started begging me to help Dan get his own apartment. Apparently, his credit was in the dumps, and they thought I could either lend him money or co-sign for the apartment. I flat out said no to both. Dan got angry, accusing me of having so much money and not supporting his family. I laughed and asked, "Where were you when I needed help?" "Oh, that's right. You were laughing at me for being homeless. And don't get me started on my childhood. I could have aired a lot of dirty laundry in front of everyone, but I didn't. My mom begged me not to bring it up, but I was done with their manipulation. I asked them if they thought I was rich. When I broke down my financial situation, how I'd saved for years to get my house, how most of my income goes to bills, mortgage, insurance, and savings, they were shocked. They had no idea how much I actually worked to keep things afloat. I also refused to co-sign for anything, because if Dan defaulted on any bills, I'd be on the hook for them. That's why my parents never co-signed for him either. At that point, my mom started crying again, but my dad didn't get angry. He just seemed defeated. Maybe he regretted how he treated me all those years. Maybe he realized he couldn't bully me into giving in anymore. Who knows? Anyway, the meeting ended with Dan storming off, saying it was a waste of time. My mom apologized for him, but there was no point in trying to make it right. I was done. I offered to buy them all a round of soup and salad just to kill the awkwardness, and we chatted about random stuff, anything but money. My parents talked about joining a local church, and when they invited me to go with them, I politely declined. They didn't push. Dan left a tip on the table, and we all parted ways. It wasn't nearly as dramatic as I expected, but it was still a step in the right direction for me. I'm finally standing up for myself, and things are slowly starting to improve. Update 4. Well, I figure it was time for another update after a few months. Things have been calm for me for the most part. I got a few cameras for the house, including a Ring doorbell, just to be safe. So far, no one's tried to break in. I think they've been scared off after the whole incident last year. I've also rented out a couple of rooms in my house to some friends. It's been great. They're quiet, respectful, and it's helped me out financially. But, of course, my parents and Sil weren't thrilled. My mom cried to me about how I could have rented those rooms to Dan and his family instead. I pointed out that Dan had broken into my house before, and I'd never let someone like that move in. Not to mention, the house just isn't big enough for everyone. It's a 3-bedroom manufactured home, and I'm not sharing it with them. When my parents found out about the tenants, they weren't pleased. Sil found out and told my mom, who came over in tears. But after some arguments, my mom admitted she was just desperate. As for Sil, things have only gotten worse for her. Turns out, Dan's youngest child isn't actually his. Sil had an affair, which some people had guessed earlier. Dan is now getting a divorce, and he actually won that battle in court, since we live in a no-fault state. He also managed to get his name removed from the birth certificate of the youngest child. After everything that went down, it's clear that Sil's toxic behavior has caught up with her. She was trying to manipulate my parents and Dan into believing I had tons of money, but it all blew up in her face. She convinced them to come to my Christmas party, thinking they could make amends with me. But when they showed up, I exposed them for all the manipulative things they'd done. It was a wake-up call for everyone, and my parents are now finally starting to see me in a new light. I'd never seen my father apologize like that to anyone. And the man's not a good actor, so this felt genuine. He fully acknowledged what he'd done to me, and there was no excuse for it. He even described himself as a narcissist and admitted the truth. He had wronged me badly. But then, of course, he threw Sil under the bus, blaming her for a lot of things. Not that she wasn't guilty of everything he said. She absolutely was. My parents had been seeing a counselor for a while, and they did offer family therapy, but I declined. I'm not ready for that anytime soon. Dan, on the other hand, didn't apologize for a while, but I could see how remorseful he was whenever the past was brought up. Meanwhile, Dan and Sil's marriage fell apart. No slow crumble. It was more like a cascading disaster. With me out of the picture as the family's scapegoat and ATM, and with Sil no longer able to mock or manipulate me for money, things started unraveling quickly. After the public humiliation, my Reddit posts, and the animated video online, Sil finally revealed enough of her toxic behavior for Dan and my parents to realize that she wasn't the person they thought she was. Their denial had been strong, but Sil's entitlement was stronger. In my mind, I couldn't help but picture this entire drama like a Star Wars lightsaber duel. Sil dressed like some kind of bimbo Sith, wielding a lightsaber shaped like a giant lipstick or something. There were plenty of jokes and puns to be had, but I didn't care to dwell on it for long. Things, of course, only got worse as Sil kept looking for ways to get what she wanted. She repeatedly brought up ads for used campers and RVs, trying to convince my parents to buy one so she could move in and take over the house. She even suggested they buy an RV to live out of like normal old people. It was ridiculous. My parents suggested instead that she and Dan buy a camper to live in, but Sil refused. She claimed she shouldn't have to do that because, as the mother, she believed she had total parental authority. When she didn't get her way, Sil took the baby and disappeared for several days. My parents knew she was fine. Her phone was still on, and she was texting with short but passive-aggressive replies. When she finally returned, she was even more embittered, especially after no one had caved to her demands. Sil also refused to go to church, while Dan went with our parents and took the kids, except for the baby, because Sil wouldn't let him take the child anywhere. Personally, I don't go to church. I believe in God and all that, but I just never saw the point growing up. Here's where it all really hit the fan. Dan suddenly called out his wife for cheating, and it shocked all of us, because we had all thought he was a complete pushover. But no, he wasn't anymore. You all know how he treated me when I was on his bad side. Well, his wife didn't get a pass. He started connecting the dots, and after pulling his head out of the sand, he secretly had DNA tests done for all of his kids. 3 of the kids were his, but the youngest, the baby, wasn't. For the record, Dan and I both have nearly black, straight hair, and so do our parents. Syl's hair is also dark and straight, but the baby's hair was lighter and a bit curly. At first, Dan thought it was just a phase, but as the baby's hair didn't darken, that was his first clue. Dan confronted Syl with the DNA results in front of our parents. She broke down immediately, crying that it was a mistake. But Dan wasn't having it. He pulled out all the receipts, phone records, bank records, texts from her phone, and the DNA test. He even identified the man she had been cheating with, who, not surprisingly, had much lighter curly hair. The evidence was undeniable. Dan said Syl was so bad at hiding her affair that it didn't even take him long to piece everything together. When my parents demanded Syl leave their house, she went ballistic. She started by yelling, but it quickly escalated into violence. The police had to be called by my mother. Syl scratched up Dan and my father with her long fake nails and even hit her oldest child hard enough to give him a black eye when he tried to intervene. Dan was smart enough to record the confrontation on his phone, so the police had everything they needed to arrest her. His parents had to bail her out, and then they came to collect her things and her car. A couple of days after that, Syl showed up at my house. Apparently, I was next on her list. As soon as I opened the door, she launched into a wild rant, accusing me of being the entitled bane of her existence because of my Reddit posts. She went on about how mothers with young children are the most sacred thing in the world, then screamed that giving up my house to her should have been a small thing to ask, since supporting the family was the least I could do. She said if I had, her family would still be together. I tried talking over her, but she wasn't having it. She attempted to shove me and cover my mouth, even had her hand poised to scratch me. That was when I lost it. I told her if she didn't take her hands off me right then, I would call the police. I also made it clear I had everything on my doorbell camera. The moment she heard that, she started to panic. I verbally tore her apart, telling her she had the audacity to call me entitled when she was exactly that. She didn't work for anything she had anymore, had cheated on her husband, made my mother do most of the parenting, spent Dan's money until they were in financial ruin, and acted like she was entitled to my house. I told her she was a greedy narcissist and to stop blaming me for her own actions. I then told her never to show up at my house again. That was enough to send her fleeing, peeling out of the driveway in a panic. After that, I had had enough. With Syl finally separated from Dan, I filed a report with the police for harassment and assault, both the incident from last year and the physical altercation on my front porch. The police have it all on record, and I even gave copies of the video to Dan's divorce lawyer. I filed for a restraining order against Syl, and it was granted without issue. She's left me alone since, though I'm sure it's just because her social media profile is private now. As for her blaming me for everything, that ship has sailed. Syl was still with her affair partner during the divorce, and at the time, I had no idea who he really was. But any man who cheats with someone else's spouse and gets them pregnant isn't someone with a strong moral compass to begin with. Once the divorce started, Syl admitted that Dan just wasn't man enough for her anymore because he couldn't afford the lifestyle she wanted. She actually believed she deserved to be treated like a trophy wife, to be with someone wealthy. Dan laughed in her face. He said she wasn't nearly hot enough to be a trophy wife, pointing out all her flaws. She ran off, humiliated, and had to move in with her parents. With nowhere else to go, Syl ended up working at her parents' business. Dan had stopped giving her access to his bank accounts, and she'd maxed out all the credit cards he had previously given her. She griped about having to work for her parents despite having a college degree, but they were really the only ones who would employ her. I'd heard from Dan that her parents were also disappointed in her, but who knows? They might be just as bad as she is. The divorce itself was a spectacle, to put it mildly. Syl didn't walk away with much, especially because of her affair, the abuse, and the financial mess she left in her wake. It's an at-fault state, so she lost her chance at any alimony. The court also took Dan's side, given all the evidence against her. Syl had to settle. Dan took on 75% of the credit card debt, got his name off the baby's birth certificate, and got primary custody of the kids. Syl walked away with partial custody, no alimony, and no real financial support. She can see her other kids whenever she wants, but it seems like she's barely even trying. She took them out to eat fast food a few times, but she never took them home with her. The kids are back in school now, so that gives her even fewer opportunities to see them. You'd think her parents would want to see their grandchildren, but they haven't contacted Dan about it. They barely saw Dan's children before that too, and now they may not even bother to see them at all. Do they dislike kids or something? Even Dan doesn't know, but he tells me that his in-laws were always indifferent to him. As for Dan, he really did love his wife a lot, so the betrayal of her cheating made him hit the bottle hard. Rewind back to the night of his confrontation with his wife. He came to me in a store with a whiskey bottle in hand, his face all scratched up and covered in bandages. I wouldn't say he was drunk yet, but I freaked out seeing him looking like that at first, and then berated him for driving under the influence. But that didn't really mean much to him compared to the betrayal of his unfaithful wife, soon-to-be ex-wife. We spent a few hours hanging out in my camper, so as not to disturb my tenants. All the while Dan was drinking whiskey straight from the bottle and crying that he was a fool and how he regretted ever marrying Sil. Pretty much any time he mentions her now, he just refers to her as that woman. So that's her nickname now. Ironically, this time together was the most bonding Dan and I have done in 15 years. While he didn't exactly apologize to me, he called himself a bad person with terrible taste in women, then said I at least didn't make his mistakes. Despite all he had previously done to me, he's still my younger brother and I couldn't risk letting him try to drive home, so I told him to stay the night. I managed to take his keys, then set up the bunk in my camper for him to use. I rent out my spare rooms, after all. He was in no shape to drive home, and if he'd taken an Uber, he'd have to pay for it and then come back for his car later. He was still a depressed, crying mess and didn't want our parents or his kids to see him like that, and frankly, I was worried he'd do something really stupid if I let him leave. I didn't want him to sleep in the house, so putting him in the camper was the best option. Just because that woman hurt him doesn't mean I suddenly trust him, so better for him to sleep it off in the camper. We both spent time in the camper playing games and watching movies on my portable DVD player. Poker was no fun with just two people, and Old Maid was just boring. Thankfully, I had an Uno deck too, and an old-school battleship game. He really liked those. It was enough to keep him distracted until he was finally willing to lay down after running out of whiskey. He threw up a lot of it in a bucket anyway, but he was not opposed to sleeping in my camper. In fact, he found the idea kind of cool. Dan had a lot of questions for me as to how I lived in the camper for as long as I did, and I answered them all, if not just to keep him busy. But I needed to go to bed myself since I had to be up early, so I left him with my portable DVD player and a couple of movies. That way he could amuse himself alone for a while, if he even managed to stay awake. Before leaving for work in the morning, I popped in while Dan was passed out in the bunk and left a bottle of ibuprofen and an energy drink on the counter of the camper's kitchenette, along with his car keys and a letter explaining that he should leave through the backyard gate. He saw himself out without trouble around 1:30 p.m. About a month after Sil, aka that woman, was kicked out, Dan came to me asking to borrow my camper. I guess he found it more comfortable than I'd thought when he slept in it, and he fully admitted he didn't ask sooner out of pride. But with his soon-to-be ex-wife out of the house, he decided to give up his room for his eldest kid. He's got 2 girls and a boy, with the boy being the eldest and now 8 years old. The kids were all forced to share a room until that point. They just had curtains up for the boy's half of the room, but the boy often slept on the couch to avoid his sisters. I know the poor kid was really desperate for his own room, so I guess Dan decided to finally make a better decision as a dad and came to see me in order to beg to borrow my camper, so his son could have his room. If he could have afforded it, he'd have bought his own camper instead of relying on me, and even said as much. I hadn't even gotten the chance to use the camper for actual camping yet, but I caved and let him use it since it was actually for a good cause. He promised to buy his own in time anyway. No, I didn't ask for rent money for the camper. Dan is in enough of a financial hole as it is right now. Sil and the divorce drained him, and I've learned that I get far better results with family lately by not being spiteful. I loaded my camper up and put it down in my parents' backyard, and my father put in a 30-amp breaker so it would have enough power for Dan to run heat and AC when he needs it. I do miss the camper after all that time living in it. It kind of felt like it was a part of me, but the only reason I loaned it out was for the sake of Dan's kids. Pretty much the only reason I still do anything for my parents or Dan is for the sake of those kids, as I've bonded with them. Yes, I know I may not get the camper back for quite some time, and likely not in the kind of condition I lent it out in, but I've warned Dan and my parents that they will be financially responsible for any damage they do to the camper, as well as its upkeep for as long as they have it. I also took many time-stamped pictures and video of the camper inside and outside before lending it out, so I can prove its condition before it left. Dan even recorded a video with me agreeing to my terms, so that's as good as a contract. With the financial drain of the divorce, Dan's not going to be able to get a place of his own for years, I'll bet. Though he seems to have no complaints about living in the camper at least, but I don't know if he actually likes it or if he's just putting up a front. But I can guess it reminds him of the backyard forts we had as kids, since that's how it felt with me sometimes. Either way, he's living in it now. I did get some major props from the extended family for letting him borrow it too. I'm now referred to by a lot of them as the good brother Dan doesn't deserve. Either way, I think getting rid of Sil was a great first step in mending the family as a whole. I still have little care for my brother and parents after the way they treated me all my life, but I'm not going to let Dan's kids suffer for it. Those kids have actually really warmed up to me. They're actually happy to see me when I come over, or when they visit me. I've even babysat a few times. Now that they don't have their mother's toxicity around, they've become much nicer kids, especially to me. I'm actually getting to enjoy being an uncle now. My mother is still doing the bulk of the parenting for my nibblings, and she's been acting as nice as possible to stay on my good side. My father often looks very defeated in my presence, but otherwise he's been either stoically quiet or just generally nice to me. But he won't talk to me much. Though that's leagues better than how he was before, at least I'm not letting my guard down. Either way, my parents do seem more happy that my ex is gone, and they often say they don't know what they ever saw in her. My mother especially, because the two of them butted heads over who was mom in the house for a long time. Now for the last part, at the same time as the divorce, Dan sued to have his name removed from the birth certificate of the baby that wasn't his. That woman didn't really want to change it because it meant no more child support from Dan. She did, however, have a court-ordered paternity test for the man identified as the baby's father. I was prepared to laugh in case it turned out he wasn't the father either, but he was. Dan's lawyer had a long talk with Sil's lawyer. Sil had no leg to stand on, and Dan was ready to go to bat to make her situation even worse. She didn't have the finances to fight him any longer and agreed to changing the birth certificate. The man who fathered the child did step up to take financial responsibility as a parent, but he ended up not staying with Sil. He contacted Dan through his lawyer to tell him he'd broken up with that woman and that he wouldn't bother him again. I checked the social media of that guy after Dan linked me to it, and the man was upset that now he's financially responsible for a child he never planned to have. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit notification bell to stay updated.